Fred was hired to find Quentin Barnes' family. But if the last living family member doesn't want to meet Quentin, what's a private detective to do? Find out next on The Detective, episode number 9. Welcome to the serialized audiobook, The Detective. Written by Scott Sigler and Matt Wallace. Narrated by Scott Sigler. Hello, junkies. Welcome to The Detective, episode number 9. Second to last episode. Only one episode after this one. Not a lot of talky talk this week either because I am working batshit crazy hours trying to finish up Aliens Phalanx, meet that deadline so it can be out, I believe, in April or May of 2020. It's going to be a humdinger. There's a lot of great stuff in there. If you are a fan of the Aliens franchise, you're going to want to pre-order that bad boy. If you're not a fan of the Aliens franchise, but you're a fan of me, and who can blame you, you're going to want to get that one too. Since there's only one episode left, and that is next week, we will be having the Detective Q&A episode coming up very quickly. Get your question or comment about the Detective, the GFL, anything Sigler related. Email that to info@emptyset.com. Do you want to hear your own mellifluous voice on our podcast? Send an MP3 of your question to info@emptyset.com. I will answer it in real time on the podcast. You will hear your voice. You'll hear my voice. We'll be two lovely voices doing a duet together full of information. So get those questions in as soon as you can. As soon as you hear this, if you're listening to this in real time, that is all I've got to say. It's time to get into it. Fred and Janine have some heavy, heavy stuff going on with The Detective, episode number 9. Book 6, Ionath. Chapter 23, Garrison.
I thought Donald Pine was the answer to our problems, but now I know better,
said the Quith worker grav cab driver.
From the first time I saw Elder Barnes throw a pass, I knew I was watching a future Hall of Fame quarterback.
Uh-huh, Fred said. He said it to be polite. Why he was polite to chatty cab drivers, he had no idea, but it was an automatic reaction. He should have known it was coming. Fred had taken note of the Kraken's pendant, flying proudly from the cab's flashing multilingual on-duty sign when it picked him and Janine up at the shuttleport. Janine sat quietly. If she had any thoughts on the cab driver's devotion to her brother, she didn't make any sign.
Pine is a legend, the worker said. I do not deny it. But Elder Barnes, there is magic in his arm, and I don't even believe in the supernatural.
Fred felt like he'd been traveling for months. From Macovey, on the outskirts of the Purist Nation, to New Wittock in the Wittock Kingdom, to Capizzi in the Planetary Union, then into the Quith Concordia, for a changeover at Free Station, then to OS1, and finally to Ionath. He could scarcely remember which identity he'd used to cross which border. He was exhausted. He was also still recovering from the beating. Correction, beatings, plural. He'd been choked and punched in the records room, banged around a sandrail while dodging artillery explosions, then slapped around a bit in Stedmar's office. Fred had never been more aware he wasn't an 18-year-old raw recruit anymore. For that reason, and a few others, it was good to be heading home. He had several homes, each one belonging to a separate identity. This time, he was Garrison Woolworth, and Garrison's place was one of Fred's favorites. He liked living on Ionath, far from the reach of the Purist Nation, and just outside the crush of the Creterakian Empire's megalomaniacal thumb. Fred had swallowed a bellyful of oppression and never wanted to feel it burning through him again. The Quith valued interspecies commerce, and Fred respected their culture. Honor was a real thing to a Quith warrior, as integral to their existence as oxygen or sustenance. It wasn't just a pretense to which they paid lip service, like religion so often became in the Purist Nation. Of course, the Quith claimed their own brands of corruption and hypocrisy, but perfection thus far had escaped all cultures. Ionath City's Human District, a 6-block span teeming with Homo sapien life of every color and configuration. Literally piled on top of each other, the humans of Ionath had no choice but to get along. That didn't mean you couldn't find violence and racism around every corner, but a balance had to be maintained for everyone to live and work and play. Garrison's apartment was above a watering hole called T.O. Burt's. The proprietor, Roberto Parca, was the sole bartender and also the landlord. Burt's epic beard reached below his sternum. He loved history, beer, literature, and the Ionath Krakens. Many was the night between cases that Fred/Garrison spent hunched over the bar top, talking books and famous military battles with the man, both of them tipping a little too much. There wasn't much room in T.O. Burt's, nor was there much in the way of decoration, and a daily cleaning wasn't exactly at the top of Roberto's to-do list. These were just some of the reasons Fred loved the bar. If tourists knew about the place, they didn't come. Strangers wandered in from time to time, but for the most part, Fred knew the faces of the regulars who knew how to keep to themselves. There was an antique pool table. Roberto stocked top-shelf spirits and the best selection of cigars in the Quith Concordia. He also kept a quad-barreled pulse rifle behind the bar and watched over his tenants' quarters when they were away. Fred had always felt that live eyes connected to a suspicious, easily offended, and well-armed friend was better than any high-tech security system. The grav cab followed the radius road's curve, just another vehicle in the city's endless circular traffic, before finally depositing Fred in front of his destination. He and Janine stepped out. Fred pointed up a set of metal stairs, then handed her a metal key. She took it, looked at it like the artifact it was. "No biolock?" He shook his head. "Not unless you want Greedock's goons to detect your DNA, thumbprint, or both, and come running." "No, thanks," she said. "Metal keys work just fine. See you upstairs." She headed up the steps. She had no bag. She'd left with nothing and had nothing to carry. He would have to take her shopping soon, get her some clothes. Fred decided to stop by the bar briefly before heading upstairs. He knew he'd probably find Bert using the bar's big holotank to call up text to illustrate a point to one of his regulars. As it happened, when Fred walked in, a red-faced Bert had one finger on the tank, tracing a line of text and shouting in the face of a half-in-the-bag human customer. "I told you, idiot," Bert said. "It was 2285, and it was the gates of Absalom." The patron, a big-nosed, white-skinned tower native, Fred knew to play a mean trumpet, only nodded and asked for another drink. Fred walked up to the bar. "Did I miss the entire lesson, Professor?" Bert looked up. His thick tangle of face fur split into a wide smile. "Garrison!" He finished pouring the man's drink, then strode around the bar to embrace Fred. "Welcome home, Mio," Bert said, clapping Fred's back several times, loudly, causing considerable pain that Fred didn't let the older man see. "How are things, Tio?" Bert waved a hand dismissively. "The same. I don't change. Neither does my place." Fred nodded. "I count on that." "You look like you need a drink." "I need a shower more," Fred said. "I'll take a rain check, though. Listen, I wanted to tell you I've got company in my apartment." Bert smiled a smile that was more of a dirty sneer. "Really? What's her name?" Fred was happy his hetero posturing could fool at least someone. "Angelique, and her husband is looking for her. I'll have to leave her up there from time to time. You'll keep an eye out? Let me know if anyone comes sniffing around?" Bert winked. "You know it, my friend. Your piece of tail is safe as long as she is under my roof." "Thanks," Fred said. He shook the man's hand and headed upstairs. Piece of tail. If Fred wanted one of those, it wouldn't look like Janine Carbonaro. He climbed the stairs, taking a moment to look out on the circular streets of Ionath City. His trained eyes sought out anyone watching him, following him, but he saw nothing. He had done it. Now all he had to do was keep this woman safe until she decided to meet her brother. Fred walked into his apartment, locking the doors multiple locks behind him. Chapter 24. Garrisons Apartment. Janine was looking around, a frown on her face. "I thought you guys were supposed to be crazy about interior decoration," she said. "Stereotype much?" He dropped his bags just inside the threshold of the living room. Like all of Fred's apartments, Garrison's place looked Spartan. Fred didn't believe in clutter. He wasn't decorative by nature. He also wasn't a fan of too many mementos or personal knickknacks. There were a few pieces of comfortable modular furniture, a small gym set up in the corner, and a medium-sized holo tank. He kept an office in the spare room, through a tall, open arch at the end of the apartment's single hallway. Fred went there first, moving past the few pictures he'd bothered to hang. The pictures all showed a man with a mustache, more jawbone, and different color eyes. Anyone breaking in here would be hard-pressed to see Fred through the images of Garrison. Inside the office, Fred shook loose the shoulder rig that held his blades and hung it on a hook next to the archway. The desk was relatively clean as well. There were a few message boards stacked haphazardly to one side. A large display loomed over the desktop. Janine followed him in. "Is this your main office?" "I have a place downtown. I spend most of my time there." "How come?" "It's safer. Armored walls, a hidden door, that kind of thing." Her eyebrows raised. "I see you make a lot of friends in this line of work." "I'm a people person." "You should show me. I'd love to see the office of a dangerous private detective." "I'll tell you what. I'll show you my office if you meet your brother." She glared at him. "I'll let you know when I want to meet him, and you'll show me your office soon enough." "Why would I do that?" "I'm convincing," she said. "You learn how to be patient in prison. If I ask enough, you'll take me." She was so confident in herself, so assured. "My office is off limits," he said. "You can stay here until you figure out what you want to do." She laughed, waved a hand dismissively. "We'll see. Speaking of Quentin, isn't there a foosball season coming up or something?" He stared. "Foosball? Are you screwing with me?" She blinked, then smiled and snapped her fingers. "Oh, sorry. Football." "Your brother is one of the most famous athletes in the galaxy, and you don't even know what sport he plays?" She shrugged. "My brother's name is Quentin Carbonaro. Until you came to get me, I'd never heard of Quentin Barnes. I've been in prison 3 years, Frederico. Prison and in other places." Her confident aura faded. Fred felt the need to talk, to fill the uncomfortable silence. You really don't know anything about football?" She shook her head. "I'm afraid they didn't beam in holocast to my cell. Maybe you can teach me." Fred shrugged. "It's fun to watch, but I don't know all that much about it." "We can learn together. It'll be a little bonding experience. Is there a game this week?" "Season doesn't even start for a couple of months. I know that the opening game is here in Ionath, though, against the Isis Ice Storm." She clapped, a very girly gesture from a woman so hardened by life. "Can we go to it? We can study up on the sport together before then. We'll be experts." He thought of Ionath Stadium, of over 100,000 sentients packed in tight. He thought of the cameras, the guards, the cops. Most of all, he thought of how the security personnel worked for Greedock. Fred shook his head. "Not a good idea. Disguises are good in moderation, but Ionath Stadium has more biometric recognition hardware than any other place in the city. The stuff they used to scan for terrorists could turn up a hit on me or on you." He pointed to the holo tank. "If you're still around by opening week, we can watch it here." "It's a date," Janine said. "But I'm exhausted. Where's the bed?" Fred pointed to the couch. "That sleeps just fine. It's a one-bedroom apartment, so—" Janine walked to the living room's one closed door. "Thanks," she said. "I appreciate you taking the couch, Frederico." She opened the door to the bedroom, entered, and shut the door behind her. Fred sighed. There were many reasons he lived alone. This was one of them. He was also exhausted. He lay down on the couch and was asleep in minutes. Book 7, the 2684 season, Week 6. Chapter 25, The OS-1 Orbiting Death. She wore a Kraken's ball cap. He'd bought it for her back in week 1 of the regular season. She'd grabbed it and thrown it to the ground so many times in the past 6 weeks that the fabric had already started to fray. Maybe she picked up the habit from watching Hokor the Hook Chest's constant sideline tantrums.
Come on, Krakens!
She screamed at the holotank.
OS1 sucks! Get a touchdown!
He'd spent nearly 6 months with this woman. Their shared history of loss provided a common ground, an unspoken bond. She'd consistently avoided meeting Quentin. At first, her self-invitation to move in had driven Fred crazy. After only a few weeks, however, he'd gladly accepted the fact that she was the best roommate he'd ever had. "Is your brother playing well?" Janine nodded. She'd become a student of the game, learning more in 1/2 of a season than Fred had in several years. He still had little interest in the sport outside of its web of criminal connections and the high-income players that wanted to hire him.
"He's having a great season," she said. "The way he leads the team, I've just never seen anything like it. Not that I've ever watched much football, mind you."
She looked at Fred, and she smiled.
"From a distance, he seems okay. I think it might be time."
Fred forced a smile. "That's great. When you're ready, I'll set it up." He felt a pang of regret. If he had booted her to the curb when they'd reached Ionath, like he should have, it probably would have been different. But having her here, under his roof, spending all this time with her day after day, he hadn't spent that much time with anyone, not since Raphael had been murdered. Having someone around, someone who cared, it had been nice. But now she was ready to meet Quentin. She would leave, but that was fine. He'd spent most of his life alone, and he knew he'd slide back into old routines almost immediately. Old, lonely routines. Janine jumped up from the couch, clapping.
"Come on, Rekka! Go, go, go!"
The camera followed an orange-jerseyed Rebecca Montaigne as she crossed the goal line.
"Touchdown, Ionath!"
came the voice from the holotank.
"A 12-yard pass from Quentin Barnes to Rebecca Montaigne. What do you think of that play, chick?"
"A play-action boot fooled most of the defense, Massara," said the co-commentator. Maybe that was the play-by-play guy. Fred didn't really know the difference. "A much-needed score by the Krakens, but Barnes took quite a shot from Yalla the Biter at the end." Janine jumped and clapped.
"My baby brother throws for another 6.
The tank showed players gathering in the end zone. Then the image cut back to Quentin. He was facing a Quith Warrior player dressed in the flat black uniforms of the OS1 team. Quentin looked rumpled, like he just stood up from a tackle. Blood poured down from a large gash on his chin. Fred saw the look in Quentin's eyes. "Oh no, not now, Q. Not now." The warrior turned and walked away. Quentin took off his helmet, stepped forward, then whipped the helmet down on the back of the warrior's head. The warrior dropped face first onto the black turf. "High one," Janine said. She sat heavily on the couch. In the tank, a snarling, wide-eyed, blood-smeared Quentin raised the helmet high to bring it down on the prone warrior. A hurrah flew in, and Quentin's helmet instead hit the black and white striped ref. Whistles blew. More refs swarmed in.
"Turn it off," Janine said. "Now."
Fred did so. The room fell quiet. They sat there, together, saying nothing, but the look on her face spoke volumes. She looked crushed. He reached out and took her hand, not knowing what he was doing before he did it. "He's not like that all the time."
"He's like that some of the time," she said. "And some of the time is too much."
She turned to face Fred.
"I'm not ready yet. He's too violent. I'm really sorry, Federico, but do you mind if I wait a little longer?"
Fred nodded and was happy he managed to hide his smile. "Whatever you need. I'm in no hurry. Billable hours, right?" She sniffed. Then she reached out and threw her arms around him, held him tight. Her body shook a little. Fred felt tears on his neck. Janine had allowed herself to hope, and now that hope was gone. Fred held her, patted her back. "It's okay. I'm here." He was there for her. It was his job to protect her, sure, but that wasn't the only thing. He was able to be there to support another sentient, to help someone through a hard time. He hadn't done that for so long, and it felt good. Chapter 26. Someone to Talk to. Fred woke up screaming. He jumped off the couch and landed in a fighting stance, his sweat dripping down to the floor below. He looked to the corners, searching the shadows, looking for the men who burned Raphael, waiting for the axe handle to hit again and again and again. He found his blades in his hands, remembered he'd set his shoulder rig on the back of the couch in case someone broke in. He turned, looking for a target, an outlet for the rage that would not let him go. And then the room lights came on. The shadows vanished. In the bedroom door stood Janine Carbonaro, sleepy-eyed, her pajamas rumpled. "Federico," she said, "it's okay." He stared at her, his brain trying to extricate itself from the dream where everyone he saw wanted to hurt him, where everyone he saw was an enemy. The Loa crawled up from behind her back, perched on her shoulder.
This is different, is it not, Cher? Are you going to put a knife in her belly for her troubles?
Fred blinked, unsure if he was awake or still asleep. The Loa was there, on Janine's shoulder, but Janine wasn't part of his dreams. She took a hesitant step forward. He saw fear in her eyes.
"No one is here," she said. "It's just you and me. The door is locked. No one is here, Federico."
She took another small step toward him. The Loa on her shoulder pointed at the blades.
"You going to cut her, Rico? Are you going to make her pay for a murder she didn't commit? A murder that's so old you can't always remember exactly how it went down?"
Janine's wide eyes locked on Fred's. She took 2 more steps toward him, closing the distance. Her trembling hands reached up, palms out.
"Give me the knives, Federico. Sit down. Talk to me."
In his head, Fred heard Raphael's screams. But Raph was gone. He turned the knives handle first and set them in her hands. Moving carefully, she returned them to their sheaths. Then her trembling hands reached out and held his. "Sit," she said. They both sat on the couch.
"A nightmare," she said. "Something from your past? You want to talk about it?"
Fred closed his eyes. He shook his head. "No, I've never talked about it, to anyone." Janine reached up and smoothed his sweaty hair. The gesture was so tender, so comforting.
"I'm not just anyone," she said. "I'm your friend, Federico. If you've never talked about it, then maybe it's time to do that."
Fred looked at her face, at her caring eyes. She wanted to help. No one wanted to help him, ever. Everyone just wanted him to do things for them. They wanted his disguises, his skills, and, sometimes, they wanted Rico to come out and play. But not Janine. She didn't want any of that.
"Talk to me," she said. "I'm here."
Fred sniffed. He wanted to chase her out, so he didn't have to deal with any of this, but there was something about her, something that made him trust her. His name was Raphael. On her shoulder, the Loa smiled. It tipped its top hat, bowed, and then it vanished. Fred cleared his throat. I called him Raph. I loved him so much." And that was as far as Fred got before the tears came. They came, and they stayed. Years of pain and anguish, of loss and rage and frustration, they all came pouring out. Beautiful, talented Raphael burned at the stake like an animal for nothing more than being in love. Fred didn't know how long he cried, didn't know how long Janine held him in her arms. When he finished crying, he started talking, and he couldn't stop. All of it came out, finally, and for the rest of the night and into the morning, Janine sat there and listened. That was the detective episode number 9. Quentin is a giant football star. He is the star of the GFL series, which is 5 books in: The Rookie, The Starter, The All-Pro, The MVP, The Champion, and we are working on book 6, The Gangster, right now, which will also be out in 2020. He is possibly the most well-known sentient being in the entire galaxy. In the context of that series, his sister barely knows what sport he's playing. And as popular as he is, as rich as he is, as much as everybody wants to know him, wants to get to know him, she's really turned off by his violence. Football is, by and large, a violent game. And there are positions where you're not as violent, but if you are not an aggressive, physically assertive person with a violent streak in you, you've got to love the contact. You've got to love the collisions. You've got to love the damage. You've got to be super competitive. All of the things that go into making him who he is, and that internal rage he's got that he's been trying to control for a while, all of those things are diametrically opposed to the people Janine wants around her. So it's setting up quite a dichotomy. We'll get some more facets of that next episode, and the detective episode number 10. I hope you guys are enjoying the story. Get your question or comment in to info@emptyset.com. Let's chew the fat in the detective episode number 11, which will be our Q&A episode. I want to hear from you. I want to hear what you've got to say. That's it for this week. We'll be back next week with the final episode, the detective episode number 10. And until then, I will talk to you all real soon. You have been listening to The Detective, a Galactic Football League novella. The Detective is also available as an ebook and as a full-length audiobook. If you want the whole story with no waiting, visit scottsigler.com/The Detective for links to Amazon, Audible, and more. Follow Scott on Instagram and Twitter, where he is at Scott Sigler, one word, and on Facebook at facebook.com/Scott Sigler. The Detective audiobook was directed by A.B. Kovacs and engineered by Steve Rickyberg. Copyright 2019, Empty Set Entertainment, all rights reserved. Theme music is from the band Amps and Volts.